Well, hello everybody. Again, I'm Martin Murphy, the chair of Marine Energy Wales, and I'm delighted to welcome for this short insight session Claire Mack, who's the chief executive of Scottish Renewables, and also Rhys Wyn-Jones, who's the director of RUK Cymru. And what we're going to try and do in this session is just have a little look and an insight into developments in our offshore renewable industry in Scotland and Wales, a bit of a Celtic flavour, if you like. So first of all, perhaps if I ask you in turn, Claire and Rhys, just to give a little intro to yourselves and some background as to your work in our industry. So perhaps Claire, you'd like to go first?
Perfect, thank you, Martin. Yep, and thanks very much for the invitation to come today. So I'm the Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables. So we are the voice of the renewable energy industry here in Scotland. I've got about 260 members, and the majority of whom are electricity generators. But we represent everybody across the whole chain, from sort of sole traders who work on the kind of environmental consultancy side, all the way up to the people who are actually selling and retailing energy, green energy now, to consumers. So it's we don't do consumer representation, but we do represent everybody within that value chain within the industry. A lot of change going on just now, largely driven by some of the developments in the offshore sector, obviously, as they've accelerated. So really exciting time, obviously, to be in this industry.
Yeah, it certainly is an exciting time. And Rhys, what about yourself?
Hi there, and first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Renewable UK Cymru is, as the name suggests, part of Renewable UK. In Wales, our membership is historically probably more skewed towards onshore wind development, just because of the nature of the industry here over the last decade or so. But increasingly, our attention is turning towards offshore and indeed floating offshore, with the huge potential that Wales has around its coast, the north and northwest coast, obviously, through the Owler extension and potentially round 4, and then getting into southwest Wales, the Celtic Sea is an enormous opportunity for floating wind. So it's exciting times, and one of the things that I'm keen to do is ensure that we collaborate and speak to Marine Energy Wales as much as we can, because there's a lot of shared interest in the work that we have.
Okay, thanks, Rhys. And in fact, I mean, it's very clear that in the UK, the UK government has made really strong statements just before Christmas, with the Prime Minister's 10-point plan and the publication of the Energy White Paper, which notably gave very strong support to the offshore wind industry, with 40 gigawatts by 2030 being declared, and perhaps a gigawatt of floating offshore wind. So do you believe that from a Scottish and a Welsh perspective, that the devolved governments share this ambition? Or alternative, do you think that they're aiming higher even? So how do you feel about that? Claire, what's your perspective from Scotland?
Yeah, so it's been really, really good to get the Energy White Paper finally out there, because I think we've all waited for it for quite some time. I think we had some indications of direction of travel, and the 10-point plan certainly solidified that, at a point very close to the Energy White Paper. So great to finally see some really sort of firm policy thinking coming through, or just some things to bounce off. So I think it's been quite interesting. I think one of the things that I really look at in this space too is that journey of floating offshore wind, for us to go from a point where I actually feel the UK government were a bit unconvinced 2 to 3 years ago, certainly on the conversations that we were having about the power of that particular technology. And I think offshore wind have very much done a lot of the groundwork there, which they've really showed what can happen, and I think that's benefited floating. And I think it really, really pleased to see what is effectively a kind of change of heart on that, and to see it really solidified into policy with that ambition around about 1 gigawatt. I think is phenomenal. I think it's great, because we know from a Welsh and Scottish perspective, think Rhys has already mentioned that the scale of the opportunity is absolutely huge once you start to look around the coastal waters of both of our nations in there. So I'm really, really pleased to see that. Where do I think the devolved governments are on this? Certainly I can speak from the perspective of the Scottish Government. They've put forward a lot of groundbreaking policy themselves around about the offshore sectoral marine plan. Really moved up that ambition. Again, they've gone from a place where we were talking about 8 gigawatts and now moved on to 11 gigawatts within the sectoral marine plan, which is brilliant, and that's moving from a point of 1 gigawatt today. So that's a huge amount of ambition put out there, and really, really pleased to see that. And also that commitment to looking, at that plan really frequently. So, introducing a real frequency into that. So with the next round potentially looking at 2023, which we know in our sector is literally tomorrow. It will be on us before we know it, kind of thing. We've also, there's a lot of work to be done. Let's not make any mistake about that. There's a lot that needs to happen in parallel, and we'll probably talk about that later in the rest of this conversation. Also seeing strong commitments through things like the climate change plan here in Scotland. Big focus on hydrogen, and that's relatively unknown. The trajectory of hydrogen still waiting to be defined. That's not unusual at this kind of stage for the technology, but also starting to see trickle down into things like planning policy, which will be enabling. And again, Rhys had mentioned onshore wind. Again, that's a big part of the picture here in Scotland too. As we know, we've got a lot of the proportion of onshore wind in the UK sits within Scotland, and we've also got a huge opportunity in terms of repowering and new development. So starting to see that recognition of climate change and net zero coming through all of policy making is really, really welcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think offshore renewables and what it can offer, so at least at this stage for electricity generation, I mean, it's not a silver bullet. And you look at the Energy White Paper and you see the myriad of work that it will go on over the coming years in a new integrated energy system. I think that's where we'll be going in the context of the developments announced by the Prime Minister, the 10-point plan, etc. How do you see the Welsh Government's perspective and the development of our industry in Wales from where you sit in our UK Cymru?
Sure, and I echo a lot of Claire's comments. I think one of the things that stood out for me through an initial look at the Energy White Paper was the commitment to the establishing of a joint ministerial group to oversee delivery. Yeah. From my point of view, as well as a interdepartmental approach that needs to embrace, if possible, an intragovernmental perspective, so that devolved governments are feeding in directly and are part and parcel of that process. Because with net zero as the ultimate goal, the focus has to be absolutely on collaboration wherever and whenever we can get it. I think in terms of Welsh Government's ambition, it's really, really interesting, because obviously, Wales is historically an exporter, major exporter of power, albeit fossil fuel. But of course, the scale of potential for renewable power off Wales's waters means that Wales could be a huge exporter of renewable power if it chooses to be. But of course, that needs to be done in a way that leads local communities and the local economy to benefit, which is why I think it's so fundamental that when these projects are being talked about, it needs to be done with a degree of collaboration between governments, so that there's a real understanding that local economies, local communities really need to feel the benefit of these developments.
Rhys, yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. I think that's an absolutely, really salient point to be making around this whole piece, is that there is collaboration. Some of that is to do with devolved and reserved powers, and it's not necessarily just a constitutional matter. It's one that this is something we all need to do, and there are different strengths in different parts of the country and different opportunities, as you've outlined, and getting the kind of infrastructure and system right for us all to contribute, not just to our own national decarbonisation plans, but also that UK level decarbonisation plan, and never more important than in a year like this where we've got COP coming, and that international leadership is absolutely truly important. Yeah,
I mean, COP26 is clearly a highlight for our industry in later this year, in terms of being able to promote the sort of work that we're involved in. And that brings us to this whole the high level issue of net zero. And I see that both the both the Welsh and the Scottish governments are taking advice from the UK Climate Change Committee, who've provided some really quite stimulating reading and work and reports for both governments in terms of advising or guiding how the devolved countries may well achieve net zero. I mean, do you agree that our industry, the offshore renewables industry, can help in delivery? I think I know the answer to that, but how do you see the situation in respectively in Scotland and Wales? Claire?
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, you would expect that to be my answer. It needs a lot of work to happen in parallel. We are aware of that around sort of grid issues and environmental issues, and that kind of the coexistence piece as well around different users of the sea, and getting structures in place to make that work. So I think that's, we know that the CCC pulls no punches, and they are going to be, very clear and frank with governments about what needs to be done and what is within their gift. It's not enough. That that's the CCC's view. It's not enough to have an ambition. You're going to have a plan, and that's where we're getting to is that sort of space. But I think there's there's key phrases that have come through the kind of 6th carbon budget as well, and that's sort of dispatchable and flexible. And I think it plays to your point, Martin, that you made earlier around that whole system and integration point. We need to develop not just the relationships through things like environmental matters and coexistence, and a level of trust that actually as an industry we've been we need to get everyone to a position of maturity and recognise the role already played by the offshore sector in terms of being a custodian of the environment and of the sea. And I think that that's something that as a sector we probably haven't made enough of. The amount of data and intelligence that we now have about the oceans around about the UK as a result of having a very strong offshore wind sector is phenomenal, and we need to think about that and what we're going to do about that, because that's world-class data. I think I'm very, very clear that the amount of investment and energy that's gone into collecting that is really, really important, and it's something that we can do a lot with and show the rest of the world. Something in terms of lessons learned, but those system tools as well. I think that's, again, just all this stuff needs to happen in parallel. I have no doubt that our offshore wind sector can achieve it. just look at what they've already done. We've seen some phenomenal trajectories in terms of deployment, even things like the Aberdeen Bay wind farm and the Vattenfall farm, where the deployment of each and every kind of turbine just shrank the time that they managed to do that from beginning to end. And so I know that the industry is capable of that, and we need government to come with us too. These are big issues. We need their help to solve them.
Oh, absolutely. And I really like the distinction you've drawn between ambition and having a plan, and then it's about delivery. So yes, I think we've got a lot on our plate in the coming years. And Rhys, how do you see it in Wales?
Yeah, well, the way I view net zero is, and certainly the pandemic has heightened this as well. I've often described it as like a game of Mr. Wolf. You kind of turn around and the wolf's got closer, then you turn away, and then you turn around again and he's much, much closer than you ever thought. And it feels that the window is closing. And I think the term of the next Senedd here in Wales, 21 to 26, is going to be absolutely vital. You identified the comments that UKCCC has made. They've apportioned a lot of the success that Wales has had in terms of moving towards its net zero target, to the retirement of fossil fuel. So for the period 2021-2026, there needs to be an absolutely clear strategy from Welsh government. And again, there's a huge amount of collaboration required here between devolved administrations and UK governments on how it is going to achieve sector by sector decarbonisation, because it's not just about power generation. I mentioned earlier, we can strive ahead and put as much capacity as we want, hopefully, in terms of gigawatts and what that can generate. But if you look at transport, if you look at industry, if you look at space heating, if you look at active travel, if you look at the natural habitat, and the requirement to replant trees, to restore peatlands. These are all interconnected issues. So there has to be really now a high level, coherent, deliverable strategy for the next 5 years. And I think the next 5 years are absolutely vital. And one of the kind of energy system things that I bang on ad infinitum, and I get bored of the sound of my own voice, is grid.
Yeah.
And you know, we know in Wales that it's very, very constrained, and without action, urgent, immediate action, that situation will only be exacerbated. And that's something I do fear.
Yeah.
But I think it's a fear that Welsh Government shares, and it is. I have some comfort that they are now addressing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So if I just distill down now a little from that macro level of net zero, just to talk for a couple of moments about marine renewable energy. I mean, clearly marine renewable energy is still in its development phase towards commercial readiness. It's not at the scale of offshore wind by any stretch of the imagination. But how do you feel and how do you see progress in the marine energy sector in your respective domains? Claire, perhaps?
Yeah. And I think I come back again to the point I made earlier around about that journey of floating, and my hope being that marine renewables are going to go through that same kind of journey. So buoyed by that step change in perspective for the UK government for floating, because I think, if I from a Scottish perspective, Scottish Government have always been very supportive of wave and tidal, for obvious reasons, recognise that the resource here is excellent, and have put money obviously behind that through Wave Energy Scotland and through Saltire Prize and various other sort of packages. We all recognise that these technologies are at an earlier stage, but I do again come back to that level of trust within the sector. I think we have to be very clear that both onshore and offshore wind and floating will also do this, have carved a pathway that marine will follow, and it will be that cost reduction pathway, and they do, they look on and they recognise what it is that's happened here, and what's the game that they're playing in here. So I think that's something we need to be really clear about, is that we've now got some really experienced developers. They haven't been able to get to scale for lots of different reasons. Some of that has been policy, but some of it has been practical. I think the grid issues that hit across the whole of the renewable sector apply to them just in the same way. But in the UK, and I again sort of this large from Scotland, is we've got brilliant resource, we've got great resource, we've got super innovation infrastructure sitting around wave and tidal, and we've got a steady supply chain willing to be there to supply an industry as it grows. And if we can map that, then they will be able to come with us, and an industry that has already been very clear that it sees supply chain growth as part of its unique selling point. It sees that as sewn into its development plan, and technologies that can do different things, across both wave and tidal, different scales of devices, different methods of deployment, which will suit many different environments. Let's not forget, not everywhere else in the world is going to be able to take advantage of wind in the same way that we have. They're going to need something different, and it's that blend of technologies, coming back again to that whole system integration point that you talked about before. This is all part of the jigsaw, and wave and tidal are very much part of that too. I think what we need to get to is deployment scenarios and use cases. I think we really need to kind of bear down hard on that now, to make sure that we do sort of help map that kind of future. But that doesn't, we know what we're doing here. We're doing like a huge, it's massive change that needs to happen, and I think marine renewables certainly have got a role in all of that, and it is about us just trying to, like I say, paint a picture of what that deployment scenario looks like.
Yeah. I agree with that, and I there's a lot of work being done in wave and tide, without doubt, and also in Wales. Rhys, I know Renewable UK have tend to major more on offshore wind and onshore wind in the last 2 or 3 years, but there has been a lot of interest and support from our UK in the past on marine. How do you see things right now?
I think the prospects are really good. I was really, really pleased to see the award of the marine license for the marine energy test area. I saw that on Twitter. That's a fantastic development, and really means that things can start moving forward at pace, which is great. Listen, I mean, I think I worked in the energy industry years and years ago, when offshore wind was in its not in its infancy, but was at a far earlier stage of maturity, and people used to sort of go, oh, round 3, that's for the birds, that's never going to happen. And you underestimate, or you make predictions about where these technology deployments will end up at your peril. And the last decade has clearly demonstrated what can happen.
Yeah.
I do think it's encouraging also that with the contracts for difference regime that we now have in place, that there is that additional space.
Yes.
For emerging technologies in pot 2, which I think will augur well for the further development of projects and enable them to travel further down the cost curve. I do think in the long term there will inevitably be technologies that go forward and are reach commercial scale and are embedded, and others will perhaps not. But I think from Welsh point of view, the important thing is that those that do flourish, those that do prove themselves and do succeed, need to stay in Wales. We need to retain that supply chain expertise. We need to retain that benefit. And I know that's something which is, a key focus of the Welsh government. But, I'm hugely excited for the sector. We do in Renewable UK Wales spend more time talking about wind, but frankly, we all know that in the journey to net zero, this is a story about huge amounts of technologies doing different things. It's about horses for courses, and it's about getting that deployment right and not making silly predictions that turn out later to be completely and bizarrely wrong.
Well, thank you, Rhys. Well, thank you. We've really come to the end of our time now. Which is a shame, because I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I feel that we could go on for some time yet. But what I would just like to do on behalf of Marine Energy Wales is to you, Claire, and to you, Rhys, thank you so much for joining us for this presentation or discussion. And we look forward to working together in that strong collaborative spirit that I think we all share. So thank you very much indeed. And I look forward to seeing you again in the not too distant future, and hopefully for real sometime soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
It's good to see you.
Bye.